If you're looking for a sewing machine to get started with, this is the video for you. I'm Liz from No Trace, and I've been sewing for over 20 years, and now I do it for a living. And I have 5 super easy tips for you to find a machine and stop searching. So let's go. Okay, tip number 1 is don't buy one. Now, I know that sounds a little bit crazy, but just hear me out. I want to recommend that you start with what you have. If you have a sewing machine and maybe it's not working great, you might want to take it in to a local sewing machine repair person and have them fix it up for you. Or if you have a sewing machine that hasn't been used in a long time, you might want to take it in for a tune-up. If you don't have a sewing machine, borrow one from a friend or a family member. This is a great way to get a sense for what you like in a sewing machine and what you might want more of that's not in the one that you're borrowing. You probably know at least one person who has a sewing machine that they're really not using at all. So I would start by borrowing one if you don't have one already. It really helps you figure out what kind of machine you do want to buy if you start with what is already around you and really get a feel for how they work, what kinds of features they have, what kinds of features they don't have. And you might find that a machine that you do have and need a little TLC is just what you need for the kinds of projects that you want to accomplish. So that's the first tip, is don't buy one. Start with what you have access to already. Okay, my next 4 tips are what, where, who, and how. So let's start with what. The first thing to do when you're deciding on actually purchasing a sewing machine is to think about what it is you think you're going to sew the most of. 2 basic stitches will let you sew just about anything, and that's a straight stitch and a zigzag stitch. So if you just want the absolute bare minimum basics, a machine that can do those 2 stitches will let you sew just about any kind of project. Now, if you have a sense for the kinds of projects that you want to be sewing, I'm going to talk about a few of the features that would be really helpful for you. If you think you want to be sewing lots of bags, you might want a machine that has a zipper foot and a buttonhole foot. And you'll probably also want a machine that can sew through lots of layers of fabric, or at least 4 different layers of fabric. If you plan to sew your own clothes, you might want a machine that has a zipper foot, an overcast stitch foot, a buttonhole foot, and a button attaching foot. So those would be some of the specialty items that if you think you want to sew clothes, you might want a machine that comes with some of those features. If you plan to mostly sew quilts, you'll probably want a machine that comes with a walking foot and a 1/4 inch foot. If you plan to do a lot of embroidery stitches on your sewn projects, you can also find machines that have lots of different embroidery options that they'll put automatically onto the fabric for you. Now, if you're not really sure what you want to be sewing at this point, that's totally fine, and you can usually find add-ons for most machines out there on the market. So you don't necessarily need to know right away what you plan to be sewing. It just can save you a little money up front if you get a machine that comes with some of those features versus having to track down and buy them as add-ons later on, but you can absolutely do that for most machines. Now, if you want to sew things to sell, like you already know you love this sewing thing and you want to start making tons and tons of things, you might want to start out with a machine that has a lot of bells and whistles it's kind of a workhorse, so that can sew a lot of different things for you. It can sew through thick material. It might have an automatic knee bar, an automatic cutter. So if that's the case for you, you might want to get a pretty nice machine. But I would wait until you're totally sure before making any kind of big investment, because you might find that sewing a lot of things isn't really what you want to be doing. Okay, so moving on to tip number 3, which is where. Where do you plan to do most of your sewing? Are you going to have a designated spot to set up your machine and leave it? Or are you going to be moving your machine around your house, putting it up on a table and then taking it down? If you don't have a designated spot for your machine, you might want to get a machine that's easy to move around, so one that isn't super duper heavy. Now, if you want to take your machine places, maybe take it to a sewing class or over to a friend's house or to a quilting group, you'll probably want a machine that's not super heavy, that comes with a cover and that comes with a handle so that it's easy to carry it around to different places. Sometimes the older mechanical sewing machines have more metal parts, and so they can be a bit heavier versus some of the newer computerized machines that have more plastic parts can be lighter and a little bit easier to carry around. But that's not always the case, so you'll want to take a look at how much the machine weighs and maybe try lifting it up. If you can go see it in a store, lift it up and see how heavy it feels for you. Tip number 4 is to think about who is going to be using your new sewing machine. If it's going to be shared by you and your kids or your grandkids or young friends in your life, nieces and nephews, you might want to consider getting a machine that has speed control. So that lets you slow down how fast the machine sews. This is a really great feature, not just for kids, but for adults too. And I'm actually going to link below to 2 really affordable machines that have this speed control feature. One of them is under $200 and one of them is just over $200. If you're going to be sharing your machine with young ones, you might also want a machine that's a little bit simpler, that doesn't have too many bells and whistles, too many parts that could potentially break or need some kind of maintenance. The last tip for you is how big is your budget? So you really want to think about how much money you want to spend on the sewing machine. A more expensive machine is not necessarily a better machine, but you can spend anywhere from under $100 to thousands of dollars on a sewing machine. So think about how much you can afford on your machine. Whatever your budget is, I would recommend looking for a used machine first. I'm going to link below a Facebook group that sells used sewing machines. You can also try Facebook Marketplace for a used machine. Craigslist is also a good option for a used machine. Do try to find a reputable place to get a used machine though, so you don't get scammed out of any money. So you want to make sure that it's a nice working machine before you purchase it from somebody. But I would recommend starting with the used one, and you can save a lot of money, get a machine that has a lot of features for a lot less than new. Now, if you don't have a huge budget, but you want to buy a new machine that comes with warranties and that you could take back if there's any issues, there are plenty of good machines that are under $200 or right around $200. And like I said, I'm going to link to a couple below. So check those out. When I first started sewing professionally for No Trace, I used a very simple Brother machine that was under $200 for about 2 years. Now, if you start out with a less expensive model, you can absolutely upgrade down the road when you have a little bit more money to spend and you know a little bit more about some features that you might want to add in. This stage in my small business, No Trace, I have finally upgraded to a machine that has a lot of bells and whistles because I sew so much, and these small features like the knee bar and an automatic cutter can shave off a lot of time when I'm sewing a ton of big projects at once. So after a couple of years of working on a very simple machine, I did upgrade in order to save myself a lot of time. So that's something to keep in mind, but you absolutely don't need to start with the most expensive option. So those are my 5 tips for how to pick a sewing machine for beginners. Remember, number 1, start with where you are and what you have. Number 2 is what is it that you want to sew, and what are the basic features that you might need in order to sew those projects. Number 3 is where do you plan to sew? Are you going to have to be moving your machine around a lot, or can you set it down and forget it? Number 4 is who's going to be using your machine. Do you want to have some features like speed control for little ones in your life? And finally, how big is your budget? How much money do you have to spend? And there's lots of affordable options out there on the market. And of course, if you're ready for something really fancy, there's plenty of fancy options too. Well, I hope this video was helpful for you. Like I said, I'm going to link below to some really affordable models of sewing machines with speed control. I'll also link to the machine that I use now as a professional maker. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the No Trace channel. I'd really appreciate it. We release new videos every Wednesday on zero waste sewing and living tips and just tutorials on how to sew. So I'll see you again very soon.